I'll get started.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Thanks, Lawrence, and thank you to Cal Kappa and all of you for um, allowing us to join you. We're happy to share some information about the org standards, and particularly how it relates to the board or advisory committee, because the org standards are a little different from private to public agencies. My name is Aaron Wicks. I'm with the National Community Action Partnership. I'm joined by my colleague, Mary Beth Schneber-Remrev. We've both been in the network for a little while, and we've both wrestled with the org standards in a lot of different ways. So hopefully we can have some good discussion today. This is not just a 90-minute presentation. We really like to have that back and forth, either through the chat or I don't know, are we in meeting mode and folks can talk? Folks, we don't want to take your voice away, but we definitely do. We do feel this works better if it's interactive. So please, join in the conversation, participate in the chat with any questions or comments, because we do have some interactivity built in. Right, we want to ground our meeting today with the promise of community action, because it's something that we all have in common. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. So, thank you for joining us in the promise. We also want to kind of interrupt normal process by taking a moment to make a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who have contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. And so we do ask you to join us in acknowledging we're not all on the same physical land at the moment, but if we could acknowledge the land that we are joining from. I am joining this meeting from the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, and I pay my respect to elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. And if you want to learn more about native land, there's a link in the chat. We invite you to do that. And also feel free to make a similar acknowledgement in the chat. So thank you. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We will do just a kind of a brief overview of kind of board roles and responsibilities generally. Always good to be grounded in the fundamentals. Then we're really going to get into those org standards and how boards are so integral to the org standards in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the things we'll tease out. Boards and advisory committees, they show up in the org standards in a lot of different ways, and so we're gonna go through those. That's what the third item on our agenda is, to really go deep into those. And then we'll along the way we'll be sharing some resources, but the key that we want to do as we kind of reach the end of our discussion is share some best practices and resources for keeping on track, keeping in alignment with the org standards, because it's sometimes easy to make it happen once, but how do we make sure that we keep we keep in alignment with those standards? So we have some tips in that regard. And then along the way, and certainly if we have some time at the end, we'd love to get your questions and comments. But please feel free to do that as we go. I think that is usually the best way, and Mary Beth and I are both very comfortable with that. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Mary Beth and ask her to take us into the next section.
Thanks, Aaron. And before we do that, I want to get a quick read of the room. Guys, if you are with a public community action agency, as in your community action agency is a unit of local government, could you use your reactions and give me a thumbs up? should be able, okay, I see a couple. All right, okay, so we've got quite a few public CAAs. That's very helpful for us to know, because as we talked about yesterday, the org standards look a little bit different if you were a public CAA versus a private CAA. Also curious today, give me a thumbs up if you yourself are a board member that is joining us. I'd love to know if we have any board members on the line. Okay, I don't see any today, but
you might be a board member of your state association.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Although the organizational standards do not apply to the state association. Just need to put that out there and spare Lawrence and David. But okay, that's very helpful. Thank you guys so much. So I want to take a minute to just ground us in what a community action board is. Remember that community action boards are the governing bodies that are responsible for setting out the high level vision, mission, and strategic direction for your community action agency. They are not the folks who do the day-to-day operations. That is up to all of you as staff to implement the vision of the board, but the board gives you the guidance and direction for where your agency should go. There is some federal guidance that says, boards are specifically to participate in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of CSBG, and that goes for both public and private community action boards. And just as a reminder, your board typically governs your entire community action agency, not just your community services block grant programs. Now, if you're in a private nonprofit, your governing body is the board, is your governing board. But for public community action agencies, I want to recognize a couple of nuances. One, you typically have a governing body who is actually your local government, and then that local government delegates authority to an advisory council who is responsible for the development, planning, implementation, evaluation of CSBG. The authorities that are delegated to advisory councils differ. And we'll talk more about that, guys, when we get into the public CAA session. But just want to flag that nuance, and also note that your public community action board may only be over CSBG. It depends on what powers and authorities are delegated by your governing body. So just want to note that nuance for you as we're thinking through this. Very important for public CAAs, guys, just be familiar, know what your board is over, because that is where the organizational standards will apply in your agency, okay? Whatever the governing body is over, that's where the org standards apply for public CAAs only. Also want to name that our boards are made up of dedicated volunteers. They are all volunteers. No one is compensated for their participation on the board. And that boards live in a pretty complex structure, guys. They have all kinds of requirements that they have to consider in the administration of the board. So there's some rules from the Federal CSBG Act that outline what boards are supposed to do, how they're supposed to be structured. If you are a nonprofit entity, you have some state nonprofit laws as well that outline maybe the structure of your boards, maybe how meetings have to be held, who can be a member of the board, and other requirements. You might also have some state CSBG statute or regulations. We talked yesterday, CSBG is a block grant. So the feds set out high-level policy, and then they leave it up to the state to implement the more state-specific rules and regulations. And so very important for boards to be familiar with any state-specific CSBG rules or regulations that impact them. Your contracts between your state office and your CSBG and your agency might also outline some additional requirements for your board, maybe some requirements about what you have to do with board minutes, how you have to conduct meetings. Those kinds of requirements can live in contracts. Also, there might be some CSBG state policy that needs to be considered. And also, very importantly, our agency bylaws. The bylaws are written by the agency. They are your own rules. And sometimes I think folks think that they don't have to follow their own rules because, I made the rules so I can break the rules. And that is not the case with bylaws. Your board has to ensure that it is operating within what is outlined in its bylaws. It's very, very important. So also just want to name that your board of directors has some specific duties. All of your board members have a duty, and principally a fiduciary responsibility, which requires your board members to make good faith decisions that really put the best interests of your organization at heart and in alignment with the with its mission, with your organization's mission. And that should really be kept independent from any undue influence or other financial interests or other interests of a board member. And so central to that fiduciary duty, there are 3 duties that are typically recognized of all board members when you join a board, to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility. One is the duty of care. Board members need to take care of the nonprofit by ensuring that they are responsibly using its assets, which would include, its financial assets, its facilities, its people, its reputation. They have a duty of care to the organization. Board of director members also have a duty of loyalty. They need to ensure that the activities are advancing the mission. They need to ensure, again, no undue influence. Board members should recognize and disclose any conflicts of interest, and make sure that decisions are being made in the best interest of the nonprofit corporation, not in the best interest of the board member themselves, or any other, entity. They are there to serve the agency, period. And then lastly is a duty of obedience, which ensures that the nonprofit is obeying the applicable laws and regulations. It's also following its own bylaws and is adhering to any other purposes, missions, requirements of the agency. So guys, this is core to all boards, all board members. It doesn't matter if you're a board member of a community action agency or your Metro United Way. All board members are united in these responsibilities. Another context for community action boards are the organizational standards. And we're going to talk about the board's role with the standards in just a minute, but these organizational standards do outline a number of responsibilities and things that the board has to do. We talked yesterday about how these organizational standards are required for all community action agencies. They are compliance thresholds. They are minimum thresholds, benchmarks to ensure that a community action agency has the capacity necessary to be considered a part of our very special family. So the org standards are something that the board has to be deeply familiar with and ensure that they are following. And also want to call out, one of the standards, or one of the categories of standards, is board governance specifically. It's category 5. And within that category 5, we would argue that when an agency board of directors is putting into practice the organizational standards, the practices that are articulated in that category of the standards, that they are aligning with their duties. And we're going to talk about these standards specifically in a moment, but just as we're going, try to think about how a standard might align with a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, or a duty of obedience. I do want to give a word of caution, though, that in the organizational standards, it can be tempting to see, okay, category 5, that's where all the board governance standards live, and so that's where all the board stuff lives. And that is not the case. Because your board oversees everything that your agency does, there are ties and connections between all the categories of organizational standards and board duties and responsibilities. And so you really need to read closely all of the standards, organizational standards, excuse me, and see where there are some ties to your board. That goes back to, again, yesterday we talked about reading the standards in context, but also as a whole. Today, we are going to try to pull out all of those standards that have some impact on the board. There are so many of them. I got to tell you guys that we are not going to have time to deep dive each one. It is not possible in an hour and a half because they are so far reaching. So we see the board's role in organizational standards as multifaceted, really. One, going back to that duty of obedience, the board needs to ensure that the board itself is operating in accordance with the applicable organizational standards. And they also need to ensure that the agency is operating within the practices outlined within the organizational standards. That is a basic function of the board, ensure that you are complying with all applicable rules and regulations, and this is one of them. But also, the board has a role in supporting the agency to fulfill its mission, right? And you know, again, we talked yesterday about how the organizational standards are incredibly important, but a lot of times they go to the presence of an item and not the quality of an item or a practice. And it's up to the board to really help the agency assess, are we fully living into, are we fully implementing the practices articulated in the organizational standards in a way that are helping us to realize our mission. So board has both that duty of obedience, but also that duty of care to ensure that the mission is being realized. Also want to name that while the board has an incredibly important role in this, you know, all of you on this line are important in supporting the board to fulfill their duties. So your board is not going to come in knowing all of the nitty-gritty details of the organizational standards. And as we said, they're about the big picture. So they need to rely on you and your expertise to consult them, to train them, to guide them on implementation of the standards and what is important. So, you know, staff members, ensure that you're giving good training to your boards about the organizational standards themselves. Communicate with your board about the importance of them and their role in the organizational standards. If there are certain activities that need to be done, it's really going to be up to you guys to communicate that to your board, to provide good information to your board about how you are or are not meeting the standards. And then also provide resources that they may need to fully implement those duties that we just talked about a moment ago. So we'd like to invite some conversation with all of you. I would be curious to know, how have you supported your board in its roles related to organizational standards? What are some things that you have done in your local agency to help your board fulfill its duties as it relates to organizational standards? And we'll invite you to put some thoughts in the chat. As we said, you also do have the ability to unmute yourself. It's probably best if you raise your hand, just so we can have some control in that. Does anyone have any thoughts about a way that you have supported your board as it relates to organizational standards? Looking for comments in the chat. Looking to see if we have any hands raised. Any ideas, thoughts? Discuss the standards with them, right? Have a conversation. You know, board doesn't, training doesn't always have to mean like a formal, you know, sit down, hours long thing. I mean, just having the discussion, right? Talk about where we are, how we're doing, what we're seeing. What else? Go over the standards that apply to them and let them know how important they are to what we do. Yes, love that, right? Not just here they are, but why you're important and why I need you and what we need from you to be successful. That's great. Erin, you want to talk about what you put in the chat?
Well, actually, I see that someone has their hand up, so I'll defer to them.
Thank you. So my name is Rachel, and I'm with ATCA, Amador Tuolumne Community Action Agency, And I wanted to say that for our board, as the board secretary, what I like to do for every agenda that we have for a board meeting, I actually put in the agenda for each item that is addressed in the org standards, I will actually write that org standard there so that when it's that item is, when we get to that item on the agenda, the board member knows this is an organizational standard that we're going to be reviewing and looking at. And so they can pay a little bit more attention to what is discussed for that item, whether it's an action item or just a report that needs to be delivered.
Yeah, that's a fantastic practice, Rachel. Thank you for sharing. And that is a practice that we recognize as a best practice, really, is that really strong communication. Make it clear, this is something that has to be done, and it has to be done because of the organizational standards. I have seen where, the board meeting has gone long, right? And we're tempted to just kind of close down shop because we're at the end of our time together. You could mistakenly overlook something that's on the agenda that is time sensitive. When you do something like this, it makes it very clear what needs to be accomplished while we are together. So love that practice. We provide a report to our board every January that outlines we are in compliance with our org standard submission, and they can ask questions and about the backup at that time. We also reference the org standards when we work on our CAP, our CNA, and strategic plan. Yes, love that. We talked yesterday about baking in the org standards into your practices, right? So whatever your community needs assessment process is, ensure that you have those key elements about from the org standards included. Ensure that your process includes that approval or acceptance by the board, for instance. That is a best practice there. And then annual report on org standards is another great practice. Yes, I would agree, Erin. I want to thank you guys so much for offering up some of your expertise and keep it coming as we go forward. I'm going to pass it over to Erin to start to talk about Category 5 specifically to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Beth. And one of the things I want to mention is kind of a segue into this topic is that it's really important to think of your board in the context of different learning styles. Now, you might be like, well, wait, how does that relate to my board? Remember that our boards are very diverse, and just people in general are, in terms of how they absorb and learn information. So it's always a good practice to think about engaging and strengthening and educating your board in as many different ways as possible, because people learn in different ways. And so, some of the ideas that we saw about, we do an annual report where we kind of go through the org standards and what we're doing. That's fantastic. And some people really absorb a lot from that. But also flagging them on the agenda, that's a different approach, but that's also going to work for folks that are a little more, kind of curious, like, what? Wait a minute, I see there's something on the agenda about org standards. What, can you remind me? That's how they learn. So we encourage, multiple approaches. And I think that, that kind of connects to the structure and membership aspect of the board, because the org standards obviously require that boards be in compliance with the CSBG Act and with other regulations, but it's also just good board practice to have a board composition that really represents the diversity of the community. And that's really what a lot of these standards in Category 5 speak to. So Standard 5.1 is about that formal board structure, the tripartite structure. And you can see there's a slight difference between private and public, because private organizations have a little more discretion in terms of how they can implement that tripartite structure. Public boards or advisory bodies sometimes have a little more constraint in terms of how they do that. And so you just need to be cognizant of those constraints. But either way, that tripartite structure is a requirement. It's written into the CSBG Act, and that's why it's one of the org standards. Related to that, Standard 5.2 is the key phrase there is democratic selection process. And so whether it's a private or a public community action agency, there needs to be that democratic selection process, or something comparable that ensures that members of the community with low incomes or their representatives are authentically and fully represented on the board. And we've got some resources about that I'll come to in just a moment. So again, getting back to structure, I mentioned the tripartite structure. And I mentioned that it's in the CSBG Act. So 2 points that I want to make along those lines. One is to remember that the language of the CSBG Act does not say you have to have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It actually says you have to have at least 1/3 members of the low income community or their representatives. You have to have exactly 1/3 public officials, and then the remainder can be other community members representing the private sector. So most agencies just go with the simple 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But you are able to depart from that by enlarging your consumer sector if you chose to do so. And so that's a requirement of the CSBG Act. But we do want to remind you that that's not the only guidance that applies to how your boards are structured and how they operate. So please make sure that you're also in compliance with your state CSBG policies related to boards, state nonprofit laws if you are a nonprofit agency, as well as some funders have requirements for funding that specify that that there has to be certain membership or certain processes on your boards. So don't forget about those. You want to be sure that that you're in compliance. Excuse me, that you're in compliance with funder requirements as well. I mentioned that democratic selection process. A lot of people struggle with that because it sounds daunting. Do I need to have an election in my like my agency has to hold an election for board members? Kind of, yes. There needs to be a democratic selection process. It doesn't have to look like a broad community election, although it could. The fact is there are a variety of ways that this can be implemented, and CAPLA has a really great resource. So I'm not going to go into that, but they have some great resources about not just the democratic selection process, but also different ways that agencies across the country have really engaged their consumer sector and made sure that consumer voice was fully present in board deliberations. So another element of board structure and composition is recruitment. And something that I think is fairly common, and some of you may have experienced this in your own agencies, is that dreaded board vacancy. That now we have to fill that vacancy, and the challenges of filling vacancies are different for the different sectors. Okay, so there are complications for each one. So we want to just talk a little bit about how to make sure that you're staying in compliance with the org standards around board composition and selection, because some agencies do find themselves running afoul of the org standards by having vacancies that may be extended longer than what their bylaws say they should, and you have to follow what your bylaws say. So one tip is to use a governance committee, a committee of your board that is about owning all those internal operational requirements of your board. And one of the key ones is keeping an eye on membership, making sure that that board positions are filled, that board members have the training they need, etc. So a governance committee is a great way to engage your board and have them help fill those vacancies and anticipate them before they come up. You also want to think strategically about your board composition because you want to be sure you have a mix of board members that provide the support that your agency needs. And the great thing about community action is that we're all different, and different communities and different community action agencies may have different needs in terms of expertise. So finance, legal, fundraising, advocacy, etc. You may not be able to get all of the areas of expertise that you need, but you can be strategic and think through what kind of a person do we need on our board? We really need a fiscal person. We need a good fundraiser. And so one way to do that is through the use of a board matrix. And it really is just that. It's a matrix of columns that help you kind of literally check the box. In our private sector, board members, what is their background? What sorts of relationships do they have? And you can use this matrix to sort of see who do you have? What resources do you have in terms of the people on your board, and where are there gaps, so that the next time a vacancy becomes available, you can say, this is the perfect time for us to find someone with some fundraising expertise, because our board matrix is showing that we kind of have a gap there, and that would really help us. And this is a tool that we have available on our website. So let's just pause a little bit and get your thoughts about some of these topics, and particularly recruiting board members, because we hear that that's a challenge, and it can be particularly challenging in more challenging times like we've had in the last 2 years. So does anyone have any best practices or particular strategies that you found that work well with the different sectors? Because as we said, it's a different approach to get elected officials or consumer sector representatives, or the right mix of private sector representatives. So what are some of the things that have worked for you all in terms of making sure that you've got really good board composition? Or what unmet challenges? Are there some challenges that folks have had that you're like, hey, does someone know how to do this? Because we have not figured it out yet. Might be an opportunity to get some help from a peer. You guys are doing a great job recruiting board members. That's fantastic.
Erin, while folks are getting their thoughts in the chat, maybe I'll just share this practice of, when you go through the board matrix and identify where you have some needs, you don't have to wait for the vacancy to actually happen to begin to think about who would be a good person to fill a vacancy if it were to arise. And so we had a practice of always have the name of your next 5 board members in your top drawer, because vacancies are going to happen. It is a known thing that will happen. So we were prepared when that vacancy arose so we could respond quickly.
And I want to highlight the comment from Christina in the chat about being on the agendas with the Head Start Policy Council and Housing Authority residents. Excellent places to go to not only inform the community about what your organization is doing and kind of what your board is doing, but also to have that presence so that people can say, oh, how could I become a board member? It definitely works much better to build those relationships and keep them open, rather than to do a once a year appeal for board members. So that's a great practice to just have it on the agenda, let people know those opportunities come up frequently, and so they can get their name on the list. Thank you for sharing that. Anything else before we move on to the next topic? All right. Mary Beth.
Thanks, Aaron. So I'll pick up with bylaws and documentation. So there are a couple of standards around bylaws specifically and around how you are documenting certain aspects of your board operations. So one requirement here for private CAAs is that your bylaws are reviewed by an attorney at least every 5 years. And it's not just reviewed, you have to have documentation that your bylaws were reviewed. And that's to assure that they're up to date. We just talked about all of those legal requirements that boards have. So an attorney review will ensure that your board is operating within, the requirements of the law. For public caps, this is actually one of those standards that is not applicable. It does not apply to you. There's a requirement that you have to give each board member a copy of the bylaws at least once every 2 years. And again, you have to document that. You have to document that you've given those bylaws to board members at least every 2 years. And that's both private and public. You have to meet in accordance with the frequency and quorum requirements outlined in your bylaws and fill board vacancies as you set out in your bylaws. So we just talked about filling board vacancies. There's all kinds of great things you can do, but you got to be sure that you're following your own rules for how you go about filling those vacancies. We also see that each board member has to sign a conflict of interest policy within the last 2 years. And that is the same for public agencies. With a caveat that you might not call it a conflict of interest policy. You might have some other blanket policy that has to be signed for all of your advisory board members, and that would be okay. But that goes back to the duty of loyalty, right? That you ensure that folks who are participating in the board understand that they have a duty of loyalty to your organization and should avoid any conflicts of interest, or at the very least disclose them to you. So talked about this briefly at the top of the call. Bylaws are created by your board and therefore they can be amended by your board. We see pretty frequently where sometimes community action agencies really well-meaningly paint themselves into a corner with their bylaws. They make their bylaws far stricter than is required by federal or state law. Want to encourage you to think about keeping your bylaws specific but flexible. And there's a great resource on the Cap Law website about weatherproofing your bylaws that talks about exactly this. For instance, when the pandemic hit, some boards got really tied up because they couldn't meet. They couldn't meet in person, and maybe their bylaws called for a certain way that they had to meet or how they had to vote, and so their bylaws kind of tied their hands. So want you to think about, ensuring that your bylaws give you enough flexibility to operate in a variety of situations or have some rules around what to do in certain crises or things like that. Check out that weatherproofing resource from Cap Law for sure. But let's say that you look at your bylaws and you see, gosh, we have painted ourselves into a corner. What do? You can change your bylaws. Just make sure that those bylaw updates that you're making are following whatever process is required within your bylaws. We have seen this where folks thought that they updated their bylaws, but they didn't follow their process. And so their new rule actually was invalid. And then the board was getting itself into trouble for being out of compliance with its own rules. You also need to ensure that any amendments you are making are compliant with relevant, obviously, federal, state, and local requirements. And that is, again, where attorney review comes in. Ensuring that you've got that legal expertise. If you have a lawyer on your board, even better, to kind of help guide you as you are considering making any bylaw updates. So, document. We all love documentation, but I got to tell you, we heard this yesterday from CSD. One of the most common reasons that organizational standards are missed is not because the agency isn't doing the thing that's outlined in the org standards, the practice that the org standards call for, but it's because the agency didn't document that something happened. And specifically with boards, that they didn't document that things happened within their board minutes. They forget to document that they distributed the bylaws to everybody who was in attendance, that the board reviewed the mission, or that that there was an update given on the strategies in the strategic plan. So it is incredibly important that your meeting minutes reflect the actions reflect that these actions are being taken. So I loved the practice of having the item on the agenda. That's kind of step one. The follow through is ensuring then that those items show up in your minutes. So if you are thinking, gosh, I really want to strengthen how we approach our minutes are so-so, or I'm not sure what my minutes should really look like, I don't know if we're doing it really well. The National Partnership and CapLaw actually partnered together to create a resource for community action agencies, a template of meeting minutes and resolutions, if you want to use resolutions, to help you document the actions that your board is taking. This tool is super easy to use. You can copy and paste. There are areas where you can just fill in your board's information to kind of help you have some template language to make keeping your board minutes even easier. It's also a good informational piece about, when you should use board minutes, when you should use board resolutions, and some practice pointers for ensuring that your minutes are complete and thorough. We do have a few additional recommendations for you as you're thinking about your documentation and your board minutes specifically. First is have more than one person take notes or minutes to ensure that all activity is captured. Can't tell you how often it's happened that you get to the end of the board meeting and your board secretary goes, okay, I got 90% of that, but who made the motion to adjourn, or who said this, or what time did so-and-so leave the room? So it's good to have, a primary person who is responsible, but give that person some backup so that you have a fail-safe. It is, again, a known risk and a very likely risk that your secretary is going to miss an action or two in the course of a board meeting. Also recommend that the person who is taking minutes know any key actions that need to be recorded, such as the dissemination of specific documents. So this practice of putting it on the agenda is one very simple and clear way that you can do it. My agency, we weren't quite that refined just yet. It was right when the org standards were starting, and I would go and talk to my board secretary and say, hey, here's the 3 things that are going to happen today that I need to be sure are reflected in the minutes. She also then would run the minutes, before we sent them out to the board, she would run the minutes by me to make sure that what I needed from a compliance standpoint was there. It was a very helpful practice to ensure that all of our bases are covered. Another step that you can take is call out if an action is required or is tied to an organizational standard in the minutes itself. Per organizational standard 5.4, the organization's bylaws were distributed to all board members for review and discussion. This sentence in your board minutes will help you meet at least one of the standards, just having this sentence in there. You can even take it a step further and highlight it if you want to, but this also makes it very helpful if when you're going to do your org standards review, if say you lost track of when something was done, you can easily search your Word documents for standard 5.4, and then it's right there. You're not having to go through and search for bylaws through, the term bylaws through multiple pages of notes. Dwight says we record our meetings and take notes, then create minutes from the recording. Yes, that is another practice that you can use for public agencies. You might want to be careful about that because those can then be, depending on all of the rules and whatever, those could be public documents that could be subject to public review, and just depending on any number of things, you may not want to record the whole meeting. Also understand and respect that, but everybody should do the practice that feels good for them and works for their agency. So yeah, and these are just a few tips and pointers that we have seen actually work for community action agencies. So highly recommend them. yesterday, guys, we did talk about too that so many of these standards have different timelines. There's some things you have to do every year, some things every 5 years, and it can be really easy to lose track of when things need to be done. We have a great tool, a calendar of board actions that can help you see the requirements according to their time cycles. And then you can use that to help inform your own board calendar. And we're going to talk about creating your own board calendar at the end of the session today. So I am curious if you guys have any processes for managing your documentation from board meetings, or any practices you have found that work for managing that documentation. And I don't just mean your minutes. I mean, you know, at the end of this, you do have minutes and backup documentation and all that good stuff. How do you guys manage that? What's working for you, or what's a challenge that you're having? I'd love to know your best practices. Don't see anything in the chat yet. I don't see any hands raised. Oh, we have a document repository. That's great, Christina. So maybe like a SharePoint site or a shared file folder where everything goes to live, all in one place, easy to search. Everybody knows SharePoint. Yep, everybody knows where to go. Yeah, SharePoint was a game changer for us when we started using it, because then it also assured that, like, you know, if I got sick and was out, you know, somebody else could just pick right up, right? They didn't have to get onto my computer to get the board minutes from the last meeting. It was available to everybody. Lucy says, I will share a resource I provide to my CSBG board governance and ethics trainings to help keep the CA on track with their meetings. That's a great practice, a board governance and ethics training. Yes, training is an essential function, you know, of the agency to provide the board. And actually, there is a organizational standard that speaks to providing ongoing training to your board members. Erin is going to cover that at the end of the session today. Oh, thank you, Lucy. You put it right here in the chat for everybody. So do check out your peers' great resource. Thank you so much, Lucy. That's great. So Erin, I think I'm going to pass over to you. Oh, I said at the end of the training. Sorry, guys. Next, we're going to talk about orientation training and reporting. So pass it over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Now everyone's saying, oh no, you mean this isn't the end of the training? Not yet. No, but we're getting there. We really appreciate the responses and the ideas that you've been sharing. That's exactly what makes a conversation like this work, because there's a lot of great ideas out there to share. So yeah, we want to turn to this section of the standards that has to do with orientation, board training, and reporting. So again, we have the standards here, 5.7, 5.8, 5.9, and those deal with having a structured orientation for board members within 6 months of their being seated, and that's pretty much the same for public and private agencies. Standard 5.8, and we'll have more to say about this in a moment, but kind of pause because I think of so many things that I want to say about this. Board members need to be provided with training on their duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. So that definitely suggests that it would be good to have some sort of an ongoing type of board training program, so that you don't find yourself running afoul of this, because it's a pretty easy standard to meet, really. There's not a prescription that you have to do X, Y, and Z. So we'll talk more about that. And then standard 5.9. This is another one that can be really, pretty easy to meet if you approach it the right way. But if you read too much into it, you could really make your board meetings too long. And that is that the board receives programmatic reports at each regular board meeting. So all of these standards really apply in pretty much the same way to public and private agencies. But let's get into them just a little bit more. So one thing that we want to differentiate between is orientation and training. There are two different standards on those. So those are two different activities, but let's be clear about how they differ. Orientation is something that really only occurs at one point in time. It's when you're onboarding that new board member. You're giving them an overview. Could be an overview of a lot of things, the agency, their responsibilities, could be an overview of community needs from the latest assessment. Your orientation can be as limited or as expansive as you feel is appropriate, but the idea is to give the board member an idea of what it is they're getting into and what they'll be expected to do. It should highlight some of the specific information to the community action agency, specific things about programming, about processes that they follow over the course of the year. Like in January, we review our strategic plan, or things like that. So you'll want to include sort of big picture items like that in your orientation. It's ideal if the orientation is done by staff or some combination of staff and board members. One experience that I had participating in board orientations that I thought worked really well was that every member of the executive staff of the agency that I worked at would participate in a board orientation, and each of us would introduce ourselves and talk about our department, what we do, what our department does, and kind of big accomplishments and challenges, just high level stuff to give that new board member a good snapshot of where the agency was. And then finally, your orientation, you want to be sure that you continue to engage your new member. So make sure that the orientation is kind of leaving the door open for them to continue engaging. It can be overwhelming to just sit at a table and have someone throw a 2.5-inch binder at you and say, "Welcome to the board. Here's what you need to do. Read this stuff." Think about the things that interest them, so that you can plan to engage them as a board member further as they get more acclimated to their role. So that's all orientation thinking. Training is something that should be happening on a more ongoing basis, and should be thought of as kind of ongoing reinforcement and added depth to what you did in your orientation. Now, the org standards say that has to occur within 2 years for each board member. Within any 2-year period, they need to have some training on their duties and responsibilities. It's probably a best practice to think of training as something that happens with more frequency than that. Some agencies do it at every board meeting, sort of the theory of we'll just give you a little bit of ongoing training. Some choose to do it periodically, like at an annual board retreat. So there are different ways that it can be done. We recommend that you just find a way to do it so that 2-year clock doesn't pass, because that is not only not in alignment with the org standards, but it's also, that's an awful long time to not do any board training. Training differs by being more in depth and being more topical. So generally your training is going to be on something specific like Roma or outcomes reporting or strategic plan. So think of your training as something that happens in sort of topical modules. And those should address the needs of your board. Where do we need to do some board training? Who can tell you? Your board. So that's a great activity to engage in with your board. An assessment. What do you all need to know more about? Where would you like to expand your knowledge as a board? Training can be done by staff, by board members, and sometimes it's appropriate to bring a third party in to do training. And Mary Beth put a comment in the chat, finances may be an area, maybe, because often board members come to boards with, maybe not a lot of deep fiscal expertise. So fiscal training is always a very good topic. And particularly that's something that you can do in bites at each meeting, maybe a little mini module of fiscal training, because there's so many ins and outs of agency finances. And again, just like with orientation, your training with your board should be directed at ongoing engagement. So think about where the board's energies are, and try to build your training to the extent that you can in the direction of where that energy is, recognizing that that there will be training topics that board members just need, and you may need to be creative about how you deliver those.
Hey, Aaron, could I throw in a quick point here about
Yes.
training, if you don't mind? So we talked about how board members cannot be compensated for their participation in the board, but you know what? Training is one of those things that it's a benefit that you can offer your board members. You can never take away somebody's education. And so, offering in-depth training to your board is really, it's a great benefit. I love when we see community action agencies who bring their executive board or their entire board to a conference, right? That's such a great personal development opportunity for your board. And they feel that investment in them as people, and they are then invested in you, and they are trained and have more information to help support you in fulfilling your mission. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. It's a great point. Some of the topics that you may want to consider, and again, these should really focus on the needs of your board, and where your agency may benefit from having your board go a little deeper, because there's so many possible topics. But these are really some of the common standard ones. The mission and history of community action and of your agency. Definitely at some point, maybe on an annual basis or in some other way, just training on what it is we do, an overview of our agency's programs and services, putting it all together, because often the board gets pieces of it. And so good board training could involve, program overviews, either individually or as a whole. Strategic direction, strategic planning, great training topic, because boards should be leading those efforts. And so they may need some guidance in terms of some of the best practices around strategic planning. We talked about financial oversight, organizational structure. Get that org chart in front of your board periodically, again, so that they can match the people that they see at the board meetings with the role that they play as part of the whole organization. And then, of course, there do need to be some topics that are board specific about some of the things that we've talked about today: board composition, roles, responsibilities, and board operations. And of course, board operations, that's a great time to give board members a copy of the bylaws and have them sign that they received them. And guess what? You just met another org standard and you didn't even realize it. So think about ways that you can have your training integrate with some of the other org standard requirements, because there's often a lot of overlap that you can connect with training. Now, I know sometimes we think of board training and kind of go, oh, board training, I've got to find some time to do some training with my board. What am I going to do? There are some great resources out there. And I think one of the best that we've seen, and we're always excited to share this, is a series of short, engaging videos that CAPLAW has put together. And they even gave it this great name, All Aboard. I don't know, I think it's about as creative as you're going to get from a bunch of lawyers. So, give them a little round of applause for having some fun with that. But it's a great set of videos. And as I said, they're fairly short. You can show them at a board meeting. You can ask board members, to watch them on their own time if they're able to. But that's just one resource that is a great way to provide some important information to your boards in very, as Lauren said, entertaining and engaging ways, because they really are easy to watch. And then, yeah, go ahead, Mary Beth.
Before we go forward to programmatic reports, I apologize. Did we answer the question about if members receive intro to Roma for boards, would it apply to standard 5.8? Did we answer that?
Oh, I'm sorry, that scrolled right past me. So yes, Roma for boards is something that you can count as board training. But I do want to be real clear that org standard 5.8 does have the expectation that part of the training does include specifically board roles and responsibilities. So yes, there's a long menu of potential topics. Roma is one of the core. I think it's very common that the intro to Roma for boards gets used. I would not, though, and Mary Beth, I don't know what your thinking is on this. I would not recommend thinking that training alone would meet standard 5.8, because boards really do need to know more than the Roma side of it. They need to know, what their responsibilities are. And I see you said that was answered, so I won't belabor it. But Mary Beth, thank you for pulling that back. That just scrolled right by me, so thanks for that. The last topic that we want to talk about in terms of orientation, training, and reporting is programmatic reports. And I kind of made a little joke when I talked about the standard and said, you could take it really literally and have the longest board meetings in recorded history. But you don't want to do that, and your boards don't want to do that. But here's what that standard is really all about. It's just about making sure that your board is not only exposed to sort of the governance side of the equation. Not only is that just not a good practice, but it's not going to engage your board members, because almost all of them, I would wager all of them, but there may be an exception here or there. But I think all of them are drawn to board service because they care about the mission and they care about the work that your agency is doing, and they want to be part of it. So it's really critical that every board meeting have some sort of programmatic report. It doesn't have to be a report on everything, but there does need to be some opportunity for the board to see the work that your agency is doing. Not just so that they can see the impact, but so that they can also learn about some of the implementation issues. They can also ask questions about why programs have been developed a certain way and things like that. So it's really a critical way to engage your members and keep these reports high level. Board members often don't want to or need to get into the weeds of program operations, and you probably don't necessarily want them getting into all that. But where they can be really helpful is knowing, what your programs are doing, what successes they're having, what challenges they have. And it's great to be able to wrap up a programmatic report and give your board some opportunities to help continue the success. Are there some partner organizations that they could reach out to help support the program? Connections that they have, maybe some folks in their neighborhood that they can share information about the program with as potential participants or volunteers. So it's always great to not only share the information about what you're doing, but use it as a way to engage your board and answer the question that they often have, which is, this is great, what can I do to help? If you can answer that before they ask, I think they'll appreciate that. So I mentioned programmatic reports being critical, but there's more than just those programmatic reports to go beyond that that operational activity. And so you'll notice that the standards that we have here, none of them are in category 5. And so this is an example of how your board's activities go beyond just quote unquote, board stuff. So standard 1.3 has to do with sharing information from customer satisfaction data with your board. And so that, that applies to public and private agencies. Standard 4.4, an annual update on the success of specific strategies in the community action plan. So at least once a year, you do want to give your board that nice, concise overview of here's what we're doing across the board. Here's what this program is doing. Here's what this one is doing. But that's really that high level. We said we were going to deliver these outcomes. Here's what we did. It could be an end of the year type of report, could be a progress report during the year, but there needs to be that check-in with the board that really covers that entire community action plan. Your risk assessment. Risk assessment has to be done at least every 2 years, and it has to be shared with your board. Now, if you're a public agency, your unit of local government will likely have policies and procedures around risk assessment, so you just need to be sure you're complying with those. And then the strategic plan. Just like you need to provide an annual update on your community action plan, there does need to be an annual update on the strategic plan, specifically in terms of progress towards meeting the goals. And that should hold in both public and private. In addition to those, standards 8.7 and 9.3 involve financial reporting. So that should be a part of every board meeting is some key elements of financial reporting, budget to actual, budget reports by program, as well as an overall agency budget update, because you do need to have a comprehensive agency-wide budget. And then the usual balance sheet statements of financial position or condition. Those may vary for public agencies where, depending on the unit, there may be some more specific procedures that local government requires. And then finally, standard 9.3, really just providing broad updates to your board that goes a little deeper than just progress, but does some sort of analysis about your program operations, your strategic plan, so that there's evidence that the board was not just receiving data, but they were invited to, provide some guidance in terms of some operational decisions that the staff need to make. So 9.3 is just saying you need to do more than just provide reports. You need to also have some form of engagement where there's some board review and processing, such as action items or follow-up that they may request. Just some general practices in terms of reporting information to your board. Keep it simple, high level. Think about the roles and responsibilities. The board is not your staff. They're not your CEO. They're not the staff. They're the board. And so, you want to keep it high level and relevant to their role as board members. You also always want to reinforce expectations around reporting, because some board members may have an expectation that they're going to get really detailed operational reports. And you don't want to go down that road. Trust me. You want to make sure that your operational details are managed by your staff. Obviously, if your board is wanting to know about that, then that's a discussion that your CEO and ED and your board would have about what's driving that. But you want to be clear about the expectations about what type of reporting they'll get, so that they're getting the right type of information to act on. And of course, always make sure that your reporting is giving them what they need. So one example of that is when you provide programmatic reports to your board, ask them, what program do you want to hear from next at our next board meeting? We'll have 10 minutes on our agenda. What would you like an update on? That's a simple way that you can engage your board in those types of discussions of what they need to know. We have some resources to help with some of these items. Remember, I mentioned reporting to your board on customer satisfaction. So if you want to know more about that, we have a resource, a guide to customer satisfaction that can give you a lot of information, ideas, strategies about how to approach that, and then how to take that information and share it with your board. I also mentioned the risk assessment as an organizational standard. Again, you don't have to just create a risk assessment from scratch. You're certainly welcome to do that. There are no specific parameters that say you have to do this or that. But if you're looking for a resource, we have one available, and hopefully you're familiar with it. But if you're not, please check out the risk assessment portal. We've developed it in partnership with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, which is why the web address says Nonprofit Risk. They are a wonderful friend and partner of community action. And so when you enter that portal, it is free. There is a registration process so that you can access it. But you can see that not only can you use it to conduct an agency risk assessment, there are also some other tools there about managing risk, as well as doing kind of a broader organizational assessment. So definitely encourage you to check that out if you haven't already done so. And again, you don't have to use that as your risk assessment, but it is a very easy resource to use to complete your risk assessment, and then make sure you share that with your board.
And hey, Aaron, can I just throw one other thing in there?
Please.
One of the super cool things about the risk assessment portal, not only does it take you through that really comprehensive risk assessment, like Aaron said, those reports are customizable. So there's even like we were just talking about how like what you report to the board, you want to keep high level. There's like an executive summary that you can like print out to just give to your board. So it's a really great opportunity to use the tool to keep the conversation focused.
All right, and I just took that opportunity to scroll back, and I wanted to circle back to something that Lawrence put in the chat. Cal Kappa has developed a really great virtual onboarding resource. So we talked about board orientation and training. This is a really great resource that your state association has developed, and so just want to encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. And you can contact Lawrence if you want some more information about that. I want to be sure everyone saw that, because I was rolling on by, and I didn't get a chance to pause on that. And Mary Beth, I believe it is to you with some of these other approval items that boards need to be involved in. So take it away.
Yeah, so we just talked about all these things that you have to report to your board, but there's things that actually require them to take action, that they actually have to approve before you move forward. So for instance, your board has to formally, it says, accept the completed community needs assessment, same for public and private. For private agencies, you need to have a written succession plan in place for your CEO, which includes some procedures for covering an emergency or short-term absence of 3 months or less, as well as a process for outlining for filling a permanent vacancy. But guys, all of that has to be approved by your governing board. You can't just have that policy. You have to be able to show where it was approved by your governing board. Public caps in the room, you guys have to adhere to your local government's policies and procedures for filling an interim vacancy and for succession planning, or filling a permanent vacancy as well. The organization has to have an agency-wide strategic plan in place, and that strategic plan, of course, has to be approved by your board. Strategic planning is firmly in the bailiwick of your board for setting out the strategic direction of the organization. In a public agency, your strategic plan might be called something else. You need to have some kind of strategic plan or a comparable document that is still reviewed and accepted by your advisory council within the last 5 years. Also need to see that the organization has written personnel policies that have been reviewed by an attorney and approved by the governing board within the last 5 years for our public caps, or for our private caps, excuse me. For our public caps, this does not apply because personnel policies are outside of your purview. So I want to give a quick note about approval. Timelines can be very deceiving. So it can be very easy to go, oh yeah, of course, the board just has to approve this thing. But the thing about it is that that means that you have to have the thing done and ready for review by the time that approval needs to happen. And it's not just having the thing ready to review by the time the board meeting happens. If you're like the partnership, we get materials out to our board well in advance of the meeting. And so we have to be thinking not just when does the thing have to be done in order to be approved. We need to give folks time to be able to thoroughly review it prior to that approval. So this is an item that can really trip you up. Approval also, it can get a little tricky with things like, say, your community action plan. You know, maybe your community needs assessment as part of your community action plan. And if you have like a grant, if you have a due date for that, you know, and then balancing that with your board calendar, all of that can get very complex very quickly. So make sure that you are specific about, okay, each of these things that require approval, how long do they take us to do what we need to do with them to get it to the point that they're ready for review? Think in those terms as well. Also want to note that there are a few things that just require review. It doesn't require a specific approval or acceptance, but review. So for instance, you have to make your Form 990 available. You have to complete it annually and make it available to your governing board. I'm sorry, that 8.6 private should say 8.6 public, or it says not applicable, because public community action agencies would not file a Form 990 because they're not a nonprofit entity. You also have to have a written procurement policy in place, and it has to be reviewed by your board within the past 5 years. It does not say approved, it says reviewed. And for our public CAAs, that is not applicable to you. So Erin, I'm actually going to pass back to you. That went really quick to talk about some of those standards that require specific action. I know we're coming into the last 10 minutes of our session, so we'll be wrapping up here shortly.
Yeah, that was Mary Beth's polite way of saying, Erin, we've got 10 minutes left, so, you know, don't go on long. So, but actually this final section of, oh, you can't, oh, I blocked myself. Here I am. Hi. This final section is really just the basic, you know, these are things the board needs to actually take action on. So standard 4.1 applies to both private and public. The board has to review and approve the mission statement within the past 5 years. And doing that just really requires that they, you know, that they validate, like, yes, it addresses poverty and our programs and services are in alignment. This usually isn't an issue, but it's an easy one to forget. And it only has to be done every 5 years. So make sure that you make time to do that. Standard 7.4, there has to be a performance appraisal of the CEO or executive director within every calendar year. And that's important. So some things just have to happen within a year, but this is very precise about saying calendar year. So in 2019, there has to be a performance appraisal. In 2020, there has to be a performance appraisal. You get the idea. That may not apply in the same way to public agencies where employee review may follow different policies. So just be aware of what those are. The audit has to be received by the board and, you know, kind of deemed appropriate to, you know, the agency. So they kind of have to say, yes, we've reviewed the audit and it's, you know, it's an appropriate audit. They may not like the audit, hopefully they do, but it does have to get action from the board in terms of having reviewed it and received it. And again, that'll be a little different for public agencies because audits are usually prescribed by a specific local government process. Related to the audit, so that first one was some processing of it, right? The board has to engage it, analyze it, review it. Yes, we've looked at it. Standards 8.3 and 8.4 are also very concrete and specific about the audit. The auditor needs to present it. So that's true for private agencies where they hire an external auditor to do that. That external auditor has to present that. You can't just say, yeah, we got the audit and here it is. The board needs to be able to engage the auditor. That is not necessarily the case for public caps, again, because of different audit procedures. And then there does need to be, as I said earlier, not just that review of the audit, documented in the minutes. Yes, we looked at it. We, looked at issues, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be a formal board action to accept the audit. And then there's standard 9.3, which we've already talked about. So we won't cover that again. In terms of making sure that your board is able to sort of stay on track with all of these, we really recommend that you develop a calendar. So at the bottom, we've got sort of this continuum of like, oh, there's a board meeting. Does something need to go to them? What do we need to do? You don't want to be operating in that space. You want to be more in the, the board minutes, demonstrate, regular processes. There's sort of a calendar of things so that it's like, ooh, January board meeting. That's where we do this, this, and this. So let's make sure that's ready and it's going to the board. And doing that with standardized templates, doing that with specific staff that, have ownership of some of those things is really the best practice, because as we've said today, there's an awful lot that needs to go to the board. So keeping things on a regular calendar and schedule is really the best way to do that. And so we're not going to do this here today in this discussion, but something that you all may want to do, if you don't already do this, and we would recommend, if you have not done this, it's a great exercise. Put a piece of easel paper, on the easel or on the wall if you got some of the sticky stuff, and go through month by month and talk with your management team, with your board about when your board meeting schedule is and when things happen. And that could be a great opportunity to make sure that all of those different things, those approvals, those reviews, those things that need to go to your board, you find places for them to go, so that that your board isn't getting burdened with 1,000 things going to them in one meeting because, oops, we forgot it needed to go to them and we didn't do that during the course of the year. So it's a great activity to do with your board and with your leadership team. And I think it is Mary Beth's turn to wrap it up and take us home.
Yeah, and so guys, while I'm walking through some of these things, encourage you to put any closing questions or thoughts that this evoked for you in the chat. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about, or maybe a practice that you are going to go back to your agency and do some talking or some further thinking about or implementing of. So just want to remind you that this training is part of a series. So today was the board role and org standards. We will see you again on 7/7 to talk about how to navigate some of those more difficult standards. We recognize there's 58 of these standards and they are not all created equal. And so encourage you to come prepared to engage and offer up also, your expertise, right? We all have something that we can teach and help our peers with. So encourage you to come prepared to engage. Then on 7/12, we'll talk about how you can implement some of these organizational standards and make these practices real. Also, on 7/28, we'll wrap up by talking about how you can move beyond just the compliance space, which is really where the organizational standards live, and move towards meeting or move into more of an excellence space and going beyond just the requirements. Because every community deserves not just a compliant community action agency, but a really excellent community action agency. And then, as we said before, on I just forgot what 8/17 was. August, there we go. It's the end of the day here on the East Coast. August 17th, your state association will give you a great training on a comprehensive community strengths and needs assessment approach. Guys, if you were with us yesterday, these resources are, I think, pretty much the same. Remember that we have a great landing page with all kinds of organizational standards, templates, and information. So there are great toolkits that can guide you through and talk you through how to interpret a standard, what kind of documentation you'll need, how you can move beyond compliance, resources that we have to help you meet the standards. Also, an assessment tool to help you keep track and kind of keep score of where you are. Want to lift up again those all aboard training videos. These are fantastic. We have heard rave reviews from community action agencies and their board members who have used these videos just in their regular board meetings. You know, some boards are using them every board meeting. They review a different training and they talk about it. You know, they review the videos because they're only like 10 or 15 minutes long. So can absolutely be integrated into your day-to-day practice. We talked about that there is, you have an opportunity to attend the Risk Summit for free. You heard me right, for free. You can attend this great conference on July 20th is the next session, where they're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of risk management. And you know what, guys, risk management is one of those things that absolutely intersects with your board. So highly recommend that you register. Just go to risksummit.org, 2022 risksummit.org. And when you register, select that you are part of the Community Action Network and you will get in for free. We really hope to see you in New York City, August 31st through September 2nd. We're going to have sessions specifically for board members, by the way. So thinking about that board training aspect, bring your board to New York City. It's a great opportunity to do some development. And so, as always, guys, if you have any questions, thoughts, Aaron and I would love to chat. Lawrence would also love to chat with you. If you have any immediate needs, please reach out to your state association. We are all here to support you in your work. And so with that, we'll say thank you and pass it back to Lawrence.
Hey, Mary Beth, Aaron, thank you very, very much for all of the wonderful information and for supplying all the extra stuff. Thank you everybody for participating who contributed today. We got a lot of great information from our peers, and that's a wonderful reason to have live training events. So thank you all for your participation. We will package this up and post the recording for those that were not able to attend, or if you wish to review some of this information. There's a lot of great stuff in here, and keep an eye out for that by email. Appreciate everybody's time. Thanks. Have a great day.